woke up before I opened my eyes, pulled from sleep by a shift in the room's density. The air felt heavier, not with humidity, but with something granular and electric, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm breaks. It smelled different, too. Cleaner, sharper, something like ozone and expensive soap. I lay there, suspended in a strange, heavy calmness that felt entirely foreign to my usual morning anxiety. On the nightstand, the object sat humming. A small, faceted prism of dark glass that hadn't been there 24 hours ago. I reached out to touch it, to stop the low vibration. And that's when the breath caught in my throat. The hand reaching through the morning light wasn't mine. It was slender, pale, and completely smooth. It started with Amy, of course. It always starts with Amy. She came over last night, buzzing with that specific frequency she gets when the lab work goes too well or too poorly. She carried a metal case, treating it with more reverence than she treats her own car. She set it on my coffee table and opened it. Inside sat the prism. It wasn't glowing then, just sitting there, absorbing the light from the lamp. "It's a synchronization drive," she said. She didn't use her lecture voice. She used the voice she saved for when I was going through a breakup. "We finally got the calibration right. It doesn't rewrite biology from scratch, it just listens." I remember looking at her, trying to find the joke. "Listens to what?" "To the blueprint," she said, leaning forward, her elbows on her knees. "To the signal interference. You know how you always say you feel like you're wearing a suit that doesn't quite fit? Like you're piloting something heavy and unresponsive?" I looked away. I hated when she quoted my own 3 a.m. confessions back to me. "Everyone feels like that sometimes, not like you do," she said gently. "This device, it externalizes the internal. It pulls the subconscious map to the surface. It collapses the distance between who you are and who you look like. It fixes the glitch." It sounded impossible. It sounded like dangerous, experimental science fiction wrapped in sisterly concern. But looking at the prism, I felt a pull. A magnetic tug in the center of my chest, right behind the sternum. It was the same feeling you get when you stand at the edge of a high dive. The terrifying allure of the fall. "Is it safe?" I asked. The question felt small in the quiet living room. "It's true," she answered. Which wasn't the same thing as safe, but it was the answer I needed. She told me to place my hand on it, to close my eyes and think about the version of myself that existed in the quiet moments. The version that didn't have to perform. I hesitated. My hand, my old hand, broad, square, covered in dark hair, hovered over the glass. It looked so clumsy against the sleek geometry of the device. Amy nodded, a tiny conspiratorial tilt of her head that said, "I dare you." I touched it. I expected a shock. I expected heat or pain or a blinding flash of light like in the movies. But there was none of that. Instead, the world just thinned. That's the only way to describe it. It felt like stepping from a shadowed, airless hallway into a patch of direct afternoon sunlight. The tension I had carried in my shoulders for a decade, the permanent brace against the world, evaporated instantly. The noise in my head, that constant low-level static of trying to be a man, just stopped. It was replaced by a hum, a pure, resonant tone that seemed to come from inside my own bones. "There," Amy whispered. Her voice sounded like it was coming from underwater, or from a great distance. The exhaustion hit me like a physical weight, sudden and absolute. It wasn't the tiredness of a long day. It was the shutdown command of a system going offline for critical maintenance. I barely made it to the bedroom. I didn't even undress. I just collapsed onto the mattress, and the sleep that took me wasn't rest. It was a coma. It was a biological reboot. I didn't dream. There was no space for dreaming. There was only the sensation of being rewritten, cell by cell, in the dark. It felt like being unmade and braided back together. When I woke up to the humming prism and the alien hand, the silence in the apartment was absolute. It was too loud. It was the silence of a world that had stopped waiting for me to pretend. I pulled my hand back, clutching the sheet to my chest. The movement felt fluid, lighter than I remembered. The heavy, clunky mechanics of my shoulder joints were gone, replaced by something oiled and precise. I stared at the ceiling, afraid to look down. Afraid to confirm that the thinning reality hadn't thickened back up. But the air still smelled like ozone, and my heart was beating with a rhythm that felt faster, lighter, and terrifyingly correct. I sat up. The movement itself was the first betrayal of my old life. Usually, rising from the mattress required a specific kind of heave, a gathering of momentum to hoist a torso that felt like dead weight. This time, I simply unfolded. It was fluid, liquid. My center of gravity had dropped, anchoring me to the bed in a way that felt safer, more stable, while my upper body felt impossibly light. My shoulders, usually tight knots of tension up by my ears, felt narrow and sloped. It was like taking off a heavy winter coat I hadn't realized I was wearing indoors. I rolled my neck, expecting the usual grind of vertebrae, but there was only a silent, smooth rotation. I felt a phantom sense of loss for the bulk I was used to, but it was quickly replaced by a thrilling sense of vertigo. The sheets were the next shock. They were the same cheap cotton blend I'd slept on for 2 years, but against my legs they felt coarse, almost abrasive. My skin had become a receiver tuned to maximum sensitivity. I moved my legs, and the friction sent a shiver all the way up my spine. It wasn't painful exactly, but it was overwhelming. The data input was too high. I could feel the individual threads of the fabric. I could feel the weight of the duvet pressing down on toes that felt smaller, more delicate. It was as if the volume knob on the world had been turned up to 11. The room smelled different too. The stale air was gone, replaced by a scent that seemed to be coming from my own skin. Something sharp, floral, and unmistakably alive. It wasn't perfume. It was biology. I waited for the panic. I sat there, clutching my knees that felt sharper, closer to my chest, and waited for the scream. It didn't come. The panic was there, lurking in the back of my mind, but it was trapped behind a thick pane of glass. It was distant, muffled. Instead of terror, there was this warm, confusing honey spreading through my chest. It was a sedative of rightness that made no sense. My brain was screaming impossible, that this was a hallucination, a psychotic break, but my blood was singing finally. It was a terrifying disconnect. I felt like a passenger in a vehicle that had suddenly decided to drive itself, but the car drove better than I ever could. The anxiety that usually started my day, the need to armor up, to perform, was simply absent. I brought my hands to my face. This was the test. The visual data was one thing, but tactile feedback doesn't lie. I expected the rough grit of a 5 o'clock shadow, the sandpaper texture I'd fought with razors every morning since I was 16. I braced myself for the scratch. But my palms met smooth, fever-hot skin. It wasn't just shaven smooth, it was structurally different. My jawline didn't cut a hard, square angle anymore. It curved. It flowed. I traced the line of it from my ear to my chin, and the geography was all wrong. It was smaller. It was delicate. I traced the philtrum, the soft bow of a lip that felt fuller. I pressed my fingertips into my cheeks, feeling the softness, the absence of the underlying rigid bone structure I knew so well. I looked down at myself. The gray t-shirt hung off one shoulder, exposing a collarbone that looked sharp and fragile, like a bird's wing. Beneath the fabric, my chest wasn't flat. There was a swell, a tenderness that throbbed in time with my heartbeat. I pressed a hand to my sternum. The heavy, barrel-chested echo chamber was gone. My hands, resting on the sheet, looked alien, yet correct. Long, tapered fingers, pink nails. They were hands I had never seen before, yet they moved with my intentions perfectly. Then the door handle turned. The sound was like a gunshot. I froze, pulling the sheet up, the instinct to hide overwhelming. Amy stepped in. She wasn't tiptoeing. She walked in with the pragmatic efficiency of a doctor on rounds, holding a clipboard against her chest, like a map to a territory we were just beginning to chart. Amy didn't gasp. She didn't drop the clipboard or stumble back in shock. She stood in the doorway and looked at me. Really looked at me. With a calm, clinical satisfaction that was somehow more grounding than any hug could have been. She scanned the changes with a deliberate gaze, tracking the slope of my shoulders, the softness of my face, and the way the sheet clung to a form that was undeniably, impossibly female. She made a small, decisive check mark on her paper. The sound of the pen scratching against the page was sharp, the only familiar frequency in a room that had been tuned to a completely new station. "Vitals stable," she murmured, half to herself, half to the room. "Pupil dilation normal. Skin conductivity shows massive reduction in stress markers. Incredible." She finally met my eyes, and her smile wasn't the triumphant grin of a scientist who had proved a complex theory. It was the soft, relieved smile of a sister who had just found someone who had been lost in the woods for a very long time. "It worked better than the simulations. You're stable. You're here." "Stable?" My voice cracked. It wasn't the deep, resonant rumble I was used to hearing vibrate in my chest. It was higher, lighter, resonating in a throat that felt smoother, narrower inside. I clamped a hand over my mouth, the physical shock of the sound vibrating through my fingertips. "Amy, I sound like..." "You sound like yourself," she corrected gently, moving to sit on the edge of the bed. The mattress dipped under her weight, pulling me slightly toward her, and the movement sent a ripple of sensation through my new, sensitive skin. The drive didn't change your voice box to match a random setting. It adjusted the pitch to match the resonance frequency of your internal narrative. I told you. It listens. I pulled my knees tighter to my chest, curling around this new center of gravity. This isn't listening. This is rewriting. I couldn't finish the sentence. The words "I wasn't a woman" died in my throat because, in that moment, sitting there with the sheet pooling around my waist, they felt like a lie. But saying "I am a woman" felt like stealing something I hadn't earned, like I was wearing a crown I'd found on the sidewalk. "I feel like an imposter," I whispered, the words trembling. "I feel like a ghost haunting a body that's too good for me. Like reality is going to snap back at any second and punish me for this." Amy set the clipboard down on the nightstand, right next to the dark, dormant prism. She reached out and took my hand, my new, slender, trembling hand, in hers. Her grip was firm, anchoring, contrasting with the softness of my own skin. "You're not a ghost. You're the signal. The static is just gone. She squeezed my fingers. That device didn't have a database of female features to paste onto you. It didn't have a woman setting. It just removed the noise. It took the subconscious blueprint, the map you've been carrying around in your head since you were 5 years old, and it told your cells to follow it. This isn't a disguise, and it's not a costume. It's a translation. A translation, I repeated, testing the word. It felt round and smooth in my mouth, lacking the sharp edges of transformation. Exactly. You were speaking a language you weren't fluent in for 20 years. You were stumbling through the grammar of manhood. Now you're speaking your native tongue. She looked at our hands together, different but clearly related. I didn't lose a brother. I just finally met the person he was trying to describe to me all this time. The tears came then, hot and sudden, spilling over lashes that felt longer, heavier. They weren't tears of grief. They were tears of sheer, overwhelming relief, the kind that leaves you shaking. I felt like an imposter, yes. I felt like I had cheated the universe, skipped the line, broken the laws of physics. But beneath the guilt was a profound sense of arrival. I fit inside my own skin. For the first time, my body wasn't a cage I had to manage. It was a home I had just unlocked. Okay, Amy said, her voice shifting back to practical determination. She stood up, smoothing her lab coat. The biological integration is complete, but the psychological mapping needs calibration. And you can't do that in bed. She moved toward the window, pulling the curtains back to let in the harsh, vertical truth of the morning sun. We need to get you up. We need to see how this new geometry handles the pull of the world. I looked at the floor. It seemed further away than usual. The simple act of standing up felt like a monumental risk, a test of balance in a world that had suddenly changed its axis. But looking at Amy, waiting for me, I knew I couldn't stay horizontal forever. I had to stand up and see if the ground would still hold me. I stood up, and the room tilted. Not because I was dizzy, but because the floor seemed to be waiting for a different kind of weight. I walked to the dresser, my bare feet sinking into the carpet, feeling individual fibers in a way I never had before. Habit is a heavy thing. Without thinking, I reached into the drawer and pulled out a pair of boxer briefs and a heavy flannel shirt. They were my armor. They were the uniform I had worn to convince the world I belonged in it. But as soon as the fabric touched my fingers, I recoiled. It wasn't just that they were old. It was that they felt dead. The cotton felt rough, like burlap, and the flannel felt suffocatingly heavy, like it was woven from lead. I tried, though. I tried to step into the boxers, but they hung off my new, narrower hips like a sack. They bunched in the wrong places, empty where they used to be full, loose where they used to be tight. I pulled the flannel over my shoulders, and it was worse. The coarse weaves scratched against my heightened nerve endings like sandpaper. It didn't fit. It draped like a tarp over a statue. It felt repulsive. It felt like I was trying to wear a corpse. I ripped the shirt off, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps, and let it drop to the floor. I stood there, shivering not from cold, but from the sudden, violent rejection of my own history. Stop, Amy said. It wasn't a command. It was an invitation. I turned to see her opening a second, larger compartment in her bag. She didn't look at the pile of discarded clothes on the floor. She knew they wouldn't work. She had known before I did. She pulled out a bundle of fabric that seemed to pour from her hands like water. I bought these 6 months ago, she said, her voice quiet. Just in case the math worked out. Just in case the signal came through. She handed me a garment. It was small, structured, terrifyingly intricate. A bra. I held it in my hands, the lace feeling cool and complex against my palms. I looked at her, helpless. I knew what it was, of course, but I had never had to engineer one onto my own body. Amy stepped in, her movements efficient and devoid of judgment. She guided my arms through the straps. She reached behind me, and I felt the small, distinct snap of the clasp against my spine. The sensation was grounding. It was a tight, firm embrace around my ribcage, a constant pressure that made me acutely aware of the new weight on my chest. It didn't constrict me. It held me. It created a boundary between me and the air, a sense of containment that stopped the feeling that I was going to float away. Next came the dress. It wasn't something flashy. It was a wrap dress, a deep slate blue that looked like a storm cloud. Amy held it out, and I stepped into it. The material was a heavy, fluid jersey that felt like cool liquid against my legs. As I pulled it up, I expected it to fight me. I expected the shoulders to be too tight, the waist to be too high, the sleeves to bind. I expected the struggle of the man in a dress, the friction of geometry that didn't match. But the struggle never came. The fabric slid over my hips and settled there, anchoring itself on the curve of my waist. I tied the sash, and the cloth didn't just cover me, it braided with me. It recognized the slope of my shoulders. It understood the swell of my chest. For the first time in my life, clothing wasn't a disguise I was hiding behind. It was an extension of the line my body was drawing in the air. I looked down at the way the skirt fell around my legs, moving with a slight swish as I shifted my weight. It felt natural. It felt inevitable. I took a step, then another. The heavy, rolling gait I had adopted to take up space, the man walk, was gone. My center of gravity had lowered, sitting deep in my pelvis. I didn't have to think about how to move. My body simply knew. My hips led the motion, a subtle, fluid sway that wasn't a performance, but a biomechanical necessity. My shoulders dropped, my neck lengthened. I felt light, kinetic, as if the air around me had become less resistant. I walked across the room, the dress whispering against my skin, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was piloting a mech suit. I felt like I was just walking. Amy watched me, her arms crossed, a look of profound vindication on her face. She didn't clap, she didn't cheer. She just nodded, acknowledging the physics of it. "The hardware matches the software," she said. Finally, I stopped in the center of the room. The panic of the morning had settled into a humming vibration of energy. I felt real. I felt solid. But there was one variable left. The black hole in the room I had been orbiting but refusing to look at. The tall, wooden-framed mirror in the corner. Amy saw my eyes dart toward it. She didn't push me. She just stepped aside, clearing the line of sight. "You can't trust the feeling until you confirm the data," she said softly. "Go on. Introduce yourself." I walked toward the mirror like it was the edge of a cliff. My bare feet made no sound on the carpet, but the blood rushing in my ears sounded like a roaring river. Mirrors had always been adversaries. For years, they were the places where I went to inspect the damage, to catalog the failures, to trace the widening gap between the person I felt like and the reflection that stared back with dull, tired eyes. I expected this to be a confrontation. I expected to see a stranger, a caricature, or a monster. I expected the uncanny valley, that sickening, sliding sensation of seeing something almost human, but wrong enough to trigger a primal recoil. I stopped 3 feet away. I closed my eyes, took a breath that expanded a chest that felt terrifyingly new, and looked. It wasn't a shock. It was a drowning. The face in the glass wasn't a stranger's. That was the most terrifying part. It was me. It was undeniably, unmistakably me, but translated into a language I had only ever heard in my sleep. The heavy, square architecture of my jaw was gone, replaced by a curve that swept up to ears that seemed smaller, more tucked away. The rough, blue-tinted shadow of stubble that I had fought with expensive razors and concealers was erased, not covered. The skin was luminous, possessing a clarity that looked like it was lit from within. I leaned closer, my hands gripping the edge of the dresser until my knuckles turned white. I needed to find the seam. I needed to find the glitch in the rendering. I traced the line of my cheekbone with my eyes. It was higher, catching the morning light in a way that made my face look open, expectant. I looked at my neck, searching for the Adam's apple that used to bob nervously when I spoke. It was gone, smoothed into a graceful, uninterrupted column. But it was the eyes that broke me. They were the same color, that muddy, indeterminate hazel, but the context had changed everything. Without the heavy brow ridge casting a permanent shadow, they looked enormous. They looked bright. They looked awake. The lashes were longer, darker, framing the iris in a way that made the gaze feel intense and vulnerable. I stared into my own pupils and felt a wave of vertigo so strong I almost tipped over. It was the sensation of meeting a pen pal you've written to for 20 years but never seen. The intimacy was instant, but the visual confirmation was overwhelming. My stomach turned to static. It was a violent collision of euphoria and panic. My brain, still running on the old operating system, tried to reject the data. It screamed that this was a trick, a filter, a lie. It tried to overlay the ghost of my old face onto the glass, creating a flickering double exposure in my mind's eye. "That's not you," the old voice whispered. "You're a fraud." But then I watched my reflection blink. I watched her lips part as my breath hitched. I watched a tear slide down a cheek that was soft and terrifyingly real. The synchronization was perfect. There was no lag. The woman in the mirror wasn't mimicking me. She was me. The dress, the storm cloud blue wrap, clung to the reflection, proving the impossible geometry of my new form. It highlighted the swell of hips that hadn't been there yesterday, the narrowness of a waist that looked fragile but felt strong. It wasn't a costume. A costume sits on top of the skin. This shape seemed to push out from the bone, dictating how the fabric fell. Then a second reflection joined the first. Amy stepped up behind me. In the mirror, we looked like variations on a theme. We shared the same nose, the same hairline. For the first time, our resemblance wasn't abstract. It was literal. She didn't say anything at first. She just stood there, her dark eyes meeting mine in the glass. She wasn't comparing us. She wasn't analyzing the data anymore. She was just witnessing. She reached out and placed a hand on my shoulder. The touch was electric, grounding me in the physical world when I felt like I was dissolving into the image. "You don't look changed," she whispered, her voice catching slightly. "You look like you finally arrived." I looked at the two women in the mirror, one confident, one trembling. Both real. The dysphoria that had been the background radiation of my life, the constant low-level hum of wrongness, was silent. In its place was a terrifying quiet. The silence of a puzzle piece finally clicking into the only space it was ever meant to occupy. I opened my mouth to speak, to tell her that I was scared, that I was happy, that I didn't know how to be this person yet. But before the words could form, a sound shattered the sanctuary. Knock. 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 3 sharp, insistent raps on the front door. The sound was violent, intrusive, a reminder that the world outside this room still existed, and it was waiting for a man who no longer existed to answer. The knocking didn't stop. It wasn't aggressive, but it was persistent. The rhythmic, confident rap of a delivery driver or a neighbor who knew you were home. It echoed through the apartment like a gavel, demanding order in a space that had just rewritten its own laws. Amy froze, her hand still on my shoulder. Her eyes in the mirror went wide, the scientific calm fracturing for a split second. "Are you expecting anyone?" she mouthed, her voice barely a whisper. I shook my head, the motion sending a cascade of sensation as hair brushed against my neck. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in my chest. This was the variable we hadn't accounted for. The biological rewrite was internal, intimate. The mirror was a closed loop. But the door? The door was the threshold. The door was where the private experiment met the public reality. If I opened it, the world would look in, and the world would expect to see him. The guy with the stubble and the tired eyes. Not this. Not her. "I can't," I whispered, stepping back from the mirror. My voice was still a stranger to me, lighter, softer, terrifyingly resonant. "Amy, I can't answer it. They'll know. They'll see." "They won't see anything but you," Amy hissed, grabbing my arm. "But you can't hide. If you hide now, you'll hide forever. The signal is stable. Trust the signal." The knocking came again, louder this time. "Hello? Delivery for apartment 4B? A delivery. Just a delivery. A mundane transaction. But right now, it felt like a tribunal. My heart hammered against ribs that felt too fragile to contain it. The adrenaline was a chemical flood, but it didn't feel like the heavy, sluggish dread I was used to. It felt sharp, electric. "Go," Amy said, giving me a gentle shove toward the hallway. "You don't have to explain. You just have to exist." I walked down the hallway. The floorboards creaked, a familiar sound, but my footsteps were different. Lighter. The heavy thud-thud of my old walk was gone. I reached the door and stopped. My hand hovered over the deadbolt. I looked at it. Slender, pale, the nails neat and pink against the tarnished brass. This hand didn't belong to the name on the package. "Just a second," I called out. I clapped a hand over my mouth instantly. I had meant to pitch my voice down, to mimic the rumble of the man who lived here yesterday. But instinct had betrayed me. The voice that came out wasn't a performance. It was clear, bright, and unmistakably female. It rang in the small entryway, hanging in the air like a musical note played in a library. Silence on the other side of the door. My stomach dropped. I had ruined it. I had broken the continuity. The driver would know. He would ask who I was. He would ask where he was. "Take your time, miss," the voice called back. Cheerful, unbothered. "Miss." The word hit me harder than the physical transformation had. It wasn't an insult. It wasn't a question. It was a categorization, a reflex. He had heard a voice, and his brain had sorted it instantly, without friction, into the woman box. The glitch I was so terrified of didn't exist for him. I unlocked the door. I didn't open it wide, just a crack, keeping the chain on, peering out through the gap with one eye. The driver was looking down at his scanner, bored. He looked up as the door opened. He didn't squint. He didn't do a double take. He didn't look over my shoulder for the real tenant. He just looked at me, at the slice of my face visible in the gap, at the curve of my shoulder in the blue dress, and smiled the polite, impersonal smile of service. "Sign here, please," he said, extending the pad through the gap. I took the stylus. My hand shook, just a little. I scribbled a signature that was a jagged mess. Nothing like the practiced scrawl of my old self. "Thanks," I murmured, handing it back. "Have a good one," he said, already turning away. I closed the door. I locked it. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood and breathed. The adrenaline crashed out of me, leaving my knees weak. I slid down the door until I was sitting on the floor, the dress pooling around me like a storm cloud. The world hadn't shattered. The sky hadn't fallen. I had spoken. I had been seen. And the world had simply adjusted. To the driver, there was no before. There was no transformation. There was just a woman in apartment 4B signing for a package. The glitch was seamless. The only person struggling to believe the illusion was me. Everyone else was already watching the new channel. Amy walked down the hall, her arms crossed, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. "See?" she said softly. "The world doesn't care about your history. It only cares about your frequency. And you're broadcasting loud and clear." I looked up at her, tears stinging my eyes again. But this time they weren't from fear. They were from the sheer, exhausting relief of being readable, of being legible. I wasn't a puzzle anymore. I was just her. The light in the room shifted from the harsh, interrogating glare of the afternoon to the soft, bruised purple of twilight. The adrenaline that had spiked at the door had long since metabolized, leaving behind a clean, resonant exhaustion. I sat on the couch, my legs tucked under me, a position that used to cut off my circulation but now felt effortlessly comfortable, my joints folding with a new, liquid grace. Amy sat opposite me, nursing a mug of tea that had gone cold an hour ago. Between us, on the coffee table, the prism sat silent. It was just a heavy paperweight now, dark, inert, unmagical. The low electric hum was gone, because the work was finished. I stared at the device, waiting for the fear to return. I waited for the panic that I had made a mistake, that I had erased something vital, that I had killed the man who woke up here yesterday. But the grief never arrived. Instead, I felt like I was sitting in the quiet aftermath of a fever breaking. The man who had lived here wasn't dead. He was just unraveled. He was the heavy coat I had taken off. He was the static that had been jamming the signal for decades. "It's permanent, isn't it?" I asked. The silence in the room was so deep I could hear the refrigerator cycling on in the kitchen. Amy looked up. She didn't hesitate. "The drive burns out after one use. It fuses the new biological template to the nervous system. There is no undo button. There is no restore factory settings." A week ago, that sentence would have terrified me. It would have sounded like a prison sentence. Now, it sounded like amnesty. I looked down at my lap, smoothing the fabric of the slate blue dress over my knees. The idea of going back, of waking up tomorrow with broad shoulders and a rough jaw, of having to lower my voice and harden my walk, made my stomach clench with genuine physical nausea. That was the real nightmare. This was just waking up. "I don't want to go back," I whispered. It was the first time I had said it out loud. It felt like signing a contract with the universe. "I know," Amy said softly. "You were never really there to begin with. You were just visiting." She leaned forward, tapping the dark glass of the prism. "That's why it worked. That's why the delivery guy didn't blink. You're unmistakable now. Before, you were broadcasting two signals at once, who you were and who you were pretending to be. It created interference. People couldn't read you. Now, the noise is gone. You're luminous." Luminous. I let the words settle in the air. It wasn't about vanity. It was about clarity. I thought about the days ahead. They wouldn't be easy. I had to explain this to our parents. I had to walk into my office on Monday and reintroduce myself to people I'd known for 5 years. I had to navigate a world that was often unkind to things it didn't understand immediately. The logistics were a mountain range of paperwork and awkward conversations, but for the first time in my life, looking at that mountain didn't make me want to lie down and quit. It just looked like work. Hard work, sure, but possible work. Before, I was trying to climb that mountain while wearing a suit of lead armor 3 sizes too big. Now, I was stripped down to the essentials. I was aerodynamic. I was aligned. I have to get a new ID, I said, a small, hysterical laugh bubbling up in my throat. I have to change my email signature. Amy grinned, the first real, unguarded smile I'd seen from her all day. We'll handle it. One form at a time. But first, you need to sleep. Real sleep. Not that coma the machine put you in. She stood up to leave, grabbing her bag but leaving the dead prism on the table. A souvenir of the glitch. You good? I walked her to the door. I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror again. I didn't flinch. I didn't scan for flaws. I just looked at her. At me. I saw the tiredness around the eyes, the messy hair, the way the dress had wrinkled slightly after hours of sitting. It was mundane. It was real. I'm good, I said. And I meant it. I locked the door behind her and turned back to the empty apartment. It was just me now. No guide, no magic box, just the woman in the mirror and the life she had to build. I walked to the glass, leaned in close, and smiled. It wasn't a pose. It was a conspiracy of one. A secret handshake with myself. I stood by the window, watching the city lights blur against the glass. My reflection hovered there, translucent and ghostly against the night sky, merging with the stars. The past felt like a story told about someone else, a dusty book I had finally closed. The future felt fluid, unwritten, and terrifyingly possible. The door is open now, and I'm walking through. If you want to follow where this new life leads, subscribe and join the journey. Turn on the bell so you never miss the next chapter.